Okay, we're live. Hi everyone, welcome to PAC. For anyone who is new, this is the Palestinian American Community Center. We're very excited to have Thuraya today, we're very excited for you all to join us today. So I'm going to give a little bit about just a few announcements about PAC in case anyone is late or to coming in. So we always, PAC is an open space. We love to do Palestine education. That's a big component actually of what we do. And bringing workshops and events centered on education about Palestine and awareness about Palestine is something we really try to emphasize. We're actually going to be having part of all of our community-wide programs in winter is a Freedom is the Future, which is our online Palestine education and solidarity course. That's going to be fully virtual and it is free, but we do accept donations for it. We have a lot of amazing teachers that join us for that. If you're interested, it's online. The registration is open, as well as other other events that we do after school and on weekends, from depka to cooking to everything. And if you want more information, you can see me after. So we have appetizers in the back. We also have PAC merch at the end of the event if you're interested in purchasing. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Thuraya. So Thuraya Zeidan is a teacher, an adjunct professor, and social justice advocate. She gives workshops on multiculturalism in the classroom, anti-racist teaching, foundations of Islam, and Palestine. Many of you maybe also know her from her Instagram, which is Decolonize the Classroom. And I'm very excited to have Thuraya today. And without further ado, Thuraya.
Hi everyone, and salam alaikum. I think I'm going to stick to my teacher voice and not the microphone. So Eliza, can you give me a thumbs up if you hear me back there? Perfect. So I'm going to be covering a couple of different topics today, focusing on Palestinian families in the diaspora, and also contributing to the Palestinian movement as a supporter of a liberated Palestine for people that are non-Palestinian. So I'm going to start with these foundational principles. In Arabic, they're called al-thawabit, and they're very important, and oftentimes I'm finding that as people who are supporters of a liberated Palestine, and even as Palestinians, oftentimes we're not aware of these core foundational principles, and this is based on the majority of factions that are in Palestine, not including the Palestinian Authority. And so it's important for us to know these foundational principles. The first one being liberation from the river to the sea. And sometimes we hear liberation for Palestine beginning the 1967 borders. But if you're, according to the al-thawabit, we are using the 1948 borders, and this is what we mean by from the river to the sea. So this includes every inch of Palestine. Self-determination and self-autonomy. This includes the removal of the Palestinian Authority and self-autonomy from any Arab or Muslim neighboring nation. So this would mean that the Palestinian people have autonomy over themselves, can elect their own government and their own policies. Al-Quds, or Jerusalem, as the capital of Palestine, the right of return for all Palestinians in the diaspora, and also the right to resist and a right to revolution. Oftentimes we hear people that are supporters of the Palestinian movement express their well-meaning, well-intentioned support. However, this support does not include supporting the resistance. And if we want to support a people, that does look like also supporting the resistance in order for Palestinians to have their self-autonomy and self-determination, and even to access any of the foundational principles. It's very important that we center the collective, oftentimes from our places of privilege, especially being that we're physically far in distance. And again, we can be very well-intentioned and well-meaning, but we might decide from our places in the West that we know what is best for people that are oppressed. And I just want to reiterate that oftentimes it does come from a good place. Like we might say, you know, this is what would be best for this oppressed group of people. However, it's very important to distinguish between Palestinians in occupied Palestine are silenced and they're not voiceless. And a lot of times we sort of hear people say, well, we're speaking for those that are voiceless. However, they are not. So it's just important that we're able to make that distinction. We also want to center the truth in this learning process. I am going to give you a heads up because some of what we go through in the next few minutes might feel a little bit uncomfortable. It might be a little bit challenging. However, we also recognize that this is part of the unlearning and the relearning process. Oftentimes, unlearning is much more challenging than learning, but because we're all here in this safe space, I'm going to take that as we are ready for what that looks like. So what responsibilities do we all have to Palestinian liberation? And again, especially being people that are removed in physical distance and who are in positions of privilege in comparison to people that are Palestinian and folks living on the ground. So it is our absolute obligation to shift the narrative around Palestine. We're going to talk about what that looks like in the next couple of slides, but language is very imperative to supporting this movement. Sometimes we find ourselves in positions where we are persuading people who are supportive of Western nations and oppressors and colonizers that those who are Palestinians in occupied Palestine are worthy of being valued as human beings. So sometimes people will say things like, well, the children are innocent, or let's look at the number of children and the women that are being harmed, which dehumanizes the men, and which also creates a false notion that some people are innocent and some people are not innocent under oppression. And so all people under the settler colonial regime are innocent. And so when we start to label only particular groups as such, we are doing a disservice to Palestinian liberation movement. It's also very important to keep in mind that Palestine serves us. It allows us to extend our empathy. It allows us to extend our humanity. We are not serving Palestine. And something that, is very imperative for us to understand as well, as people who are not serving Palestine, is that this is the most minimal. We're going to go through the most minimal things that we can do as people who claim that we are in support. And when we do the most that we can for the Palestinian movement, in comparison to Palestinians who are living there, folks on the ground, our work is very minimal. And so that's why we're not saying that we're doing a favor or providing a service for people that are Palestinian. Also, just a focus on having a moral compass and being principled in words and actions. When we talk about normalization in the next few slides, we're going to go into some examples that relate to this. This can look like rejecting to work on a panel where you are debating that Palestinian lives are worthy of value with people that are openly Zionist or normalizers. And also for us to contribute to this movement in whatever capacity that we can. This can look like something monetary when that becomes an option moving forward. This can look like a strike similar to the 2 global strikes that we saw the last couple of Mondays. Supporting the BDS movement. We've all seen the impact that has taken place related to Starbucks and other such companies in the last weeks. Platforming Palestinian voices. This one is very important because oftentimes people will center voices of influencers such as Sean King, for example, over a Palestinian living in occupied Palestine, sharing their lived experience. But because of things such as internalized white supremacy, and because we might be not recognizing that we're trying to appeal to Westerners, we may use certain voices to portray the Palestinian experience. But in order to portray in an authentic way anybody's lived experience, we have to use that person. So if, for example, I never experienced what it's like to be an immigrant in this nation, it would be inauthentic of me to give you presentations on the immigration experience. And so it's the same thing with platforming non-Palestinian voices when we talk about Palestine. So what are some examples of normalization? This is in reference to the heads up I gave you, the next couple of slides. So this looks like supporting solutions outside of the firmly held belief. Now this is correlating back to the principles that I shared with you in the first slide. This goes back to the thawabit, as we call them. So there's a firmly held belief that's foundational to Palestinian liberation, which is that we believe in that Palestine will be free. And so once you start engaging in conversations, one of them being a popular one being a two-state solution and such, or 1967 borders, you're partaking in normalization. And when we want to center the people and what the people want, that is not what the people in Palestine are asking for. I'm sure many of you have seen different interviews of people in Gaza and in other parts of occupied Palestine, and those people are not saying we want limitations within the country. They want a liberated Palestine, and so we must honor the voices of the people and the wants of the people. Another example of normalization is supporting any elected official who is backed by a Zionist lobby. And as election season approaches us next year, this is very important because oftentimes people in our community, as in many communities of color, we will go out and support and vocalize support for and put our votes towards people who are in the Democratic Party. And so before you do so, even when it comes to people that are locally running in your town on the Board of Education, it's very important to look into what their beliefs are around this. And I can promise you that if someone's beliefs on this are anti-Palestinian, that the person is also very likely anti-Black, anti-immigration, anti-people who are undocumented, LGBTQ, women, and other marginalized groups. Engaging with police and military for known reasons, such as the correlation between training of U.S. police and the IOF, and also believing that Zionists are capable of contributing any kind of justice to Palestinian liberation. And this is why we don't get on panels with them, we're not engaging in discussions with them. And we're gonna go into this a little bit further on the next slide, but it's imperative that we come to the realization and the recognition that if somebody already has these held beliefs, they are not capable of recognizing justice and they are not capable of recognizing equality. Again, supporting politicians and also believing that liberation will come from them. Liberation is not coming from politicians and it's not coming from celebrities. And historically, liberation comes from the people who are working from the ground up. And so, when people get very excited that a celebrity posted something online and now we're working towards a free Palestine, we want to think again, this is not how revolution and liberation work. Also collaborating with organizations where either Zionists or normalizers are members. And I said this a couple times early on, I just would like to reiterate, oftentimes we are well-meaning and well-intentioned, but it's very important that we're looking into and being mindful of our decisions and our affiliations and associations. Some other examples of normalization. Sharing propaganda from Zionists is considered a form of normalization. Also, many of us, because we want to spread awareness, and now we're nearing 80 days of the heightened genocidal massacre on the Palestinian people, particularly those in Gaza. A lot of people are sharing trauma of Palestinians on the ground. And so if by now, almost 80 days in, somebody is so unaware, perhaps reconsider sharing such as opposed to sharing something that's informational and educational, something that is related to collaboration and organizing, and something that is productive, as opposed to the suffering of the people. Engaging in online debates and panels. When you argue with someone in the comment section, you are not going to persuade them that Palestinian lives are of value and that Palestinian liberation is going to, reach its conclusion through such engagement. We want you to preserve your energy towards being supportive of this movement and not with arguing with people online. Attempting to change perspectives, this takes us back to trying to convince people that Palestinians in occupied Palestine are worthy of humanity. Again, going back to saying, well, 50% of those that were martyred in the Haitian genocide have been children. So in a way, trying to earn sympathy and empathy and compassion from people that, if they are unwilling to recognize a genocide to begin with, this is not a space where you want to input your energy. Accepting funds from foundations that are anti-Palestinian liberation. And sometimes and we see this very often with NGOs, we see this with various organizations that claim to be well-meaning, but who are in the same token accepting funds from organizations that support Zionist groups. Recognizing, so what are some things that we can do in order to be supportive of a Palestinian movement? This would look as an ally, perhaps, so as a non-Palestinian. This looks like leveraging your privilege in a way that is supportive to people that are Palestinian, being anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and not using Palestinians as a show where we're just scrolling and kind of deciding when to turn, like a reality TV show, you're deciding when to turn on and when to turn off based on mood or based on your feelings for that day. These are just some quotes that I'm going to give you a minute to read that are all have been said by martyrs related to the topic of normalization. Actually, I lied. I am going to read a couple of them. Even the Palestinian abroad, so this refers to us in this space. Even the Palestinian abroad, if they cannot be radical, they should remain silent and not be a hypocrite. In revolutions, pragmatism and diplomacy are useless. Mm-hmm. Do not even for a moment forget the existence of the occupation or normalize its presence in your life. And if that happens, you are creeping towards treason. In the last couple of weeks, I talked about publicly expressing hopelessness around the topic of Palestine. And so what that does is that releases some of your tension as an individual. But if you're trying to center the collective, that does not serve the collective. Imagine being Palestinian living on the ground in Palestine, and you're watching people in Western nations express their hopelessness about Palestinian liberation. And so, of course, our feelings of anger and sadness are valid, but we want to express them in spaces that are not public platforms. And then finally, Hamdallah's hands are clasped behind his back as a sign of rejection at a time when solutions are presented to us the American way. And this takes us back to self-autonomy and self-determination, where the people, even excluding other Arab and Muslim nations, are able to make decisions for themselves. And not as per what Western nations deem appropriate. In terms of contributing to the erasure of Palestinian identity, oftentimes we hear this argument that, well, not all Palestinians are Muslim. And that's supposed to make non-Palestinians and Westerners have more empathy and compassion because of this very commonly used and, however, not strong argument. Over 96% of Palestinians are Muslim. I actually think it's at least 98%, but this was a safer number, so I decided to give you this one. When we repetitively say, well, they're not all Muslim, what are you actually saying, and who are you trying to appeal to? It's very important to consider. And there is a correlation between anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Palestinian sentiment. The majority of Palestinians do identify as Muslim, and this in no way, shape, or form takes away from our solidarity with our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters. So we can have multiple truths. One fact does not negate another fact. So we can be in solidarity with one another, that's true. And another truth is that most Palestinians are Muslim, and that's how they identify. And so when we talk about anti-Palestinian sentiment, oftentimes we're also talking about an anti-Muslim sentiment. And you'll also find as you're watching interviews or videos or talks with people that are in Gaza and across different parts of occupied Palestine, you know, what is one of the first things that you see Palestinians talk about? It's usually has to do with their relationship with God. And it centers around the oneness of God as per our beliefs in the Islamic faith. And it's important that we shift away from that argument that, you know, well, not all Palestinians are Muslim, so therefore some of them are worth having some sort of compassion and are worth some kind of value. Also, the internalized white supremacy that we might be unaware of, seeking validation, seeking acceptance. Again, you can tie this back to the argument of not all Palestinians being Muslim. Many well-meaning people will say, will try to seek validation from people that are in Western nations so that those very people can have some kind of recognition that Palestinians are worth seeing. Relying on politicians and celebrities over the people. The Palestinian people are very capable, and they are capable of organizing, and they are capable of working with one another, they are capable of unity. And so when we look beyond their capacity as human beings, and instead we start to rally around politicians and celebrities, you know, the logic behind that is very weak. And so, you know, sometimes people, yes, you might be excited if your favorite celebrity or a politician that you support comes forth with some kind of recognition. However, the liberation of a people is not tied to positions of power. Also, focusing on contrasting empathy, we see this very often, that people who are well-meaning will try to bring up the example of why did Americans have empathy towards Ukraine? So therefore, Americans are capable of empathy. Why don't they apply that empathy to Palestinians? But we know that this stems from racism. And this, again, is where the anti-Muslim sentiment plays a role, by the way. Because people in Ukraine are not predominantly Muslim. And people in Palestine are predominantly brown and poor and identify as Muslim. And so all of those categories do not create a privileged space for them where Westerners could identify with them and could have any kinds of compassion or support towards their liberation movement. So just a continuation on, I am not Palestinian and I want to support the Palestinian movement. How can I show my support? And even for those of us who are Palestinian, this can serve as some kind of either review or, however, a resource for our non-Palestinian friends who are in solidarity. So we must recognize that the truth is the only moral act. There really is nothing else. The truth must be centered, and we have been centering it this entire time, starting with the foundational principles, the thawabit that we have been referring to in this presentation. And this relates to supporting people that are indigenous to this land that we're on. This relates to Palestine. This relates to Black liberation and to all more marginalized communities. If you have the capacity of educating people in your circles, this is very important. And this is where some of us can use our positions of privilege and leverage our privilege. following journalists and activists who are in Palestine. Because a lot of times, again, it'll look like the examples of people who are non-Palestinian, but who might be more favored, who might be popular, who might be white, who might be more accepted by the standards in our American society. And also supporting Palestinian liberation when it's not trending. And so in 2021, when Gaza was being severely attacked, we saw that, a lot of people were sharing about and talking about, attending rallies, posting about Palestine, reading Palestinian authors. Then we saw a decline in the last 2 years. It was less popular. And we saw this with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we see this across different movements where people may appear to organize and focus on the collective and work with one another. However, when it's less popular, we start to see less information being shared, less conversations being had. These are some terms that are very important for us to consider as we're learning and unlearning about Palestine. The first one that I want to mention is the word ceasefire, because everybody who claims to be in support is calling for a ceasefire. A ceasefire is just a temporary pause. But again, when we center the people that are in occupied Palestine, and I've been watching several interviews of people in Gaza, they're not only asking for a ceasefire. This is language that centers what Westerners want for our people back home. Our people want liberation of the land. And so when you say, all we want is a ceasefire, then we'll talk about everything else later. For a week again, on and off, but not really. So, the center of this and the groundwork is not to hyper-focus on a ceasefire. The word ceasefire also suggests that Palestinians should stop resisting, that they should stop defending themselves against this genocidal occupation, and that a ceasefire, everybody returns to normal. But what is normal under the settler colonial genocidal regime? Also, the word apartheid, when you use the word apartheid alone to describe the settler colonial regime, this suggests that Palestinians want equality with their oppressor. First, we have to come to an understanding that the oppressor is not capable of giving the oppressed equality. So even that is off the table from the beginning when you look at this. And so when we say, this is the Israeli government is an apartheid regime, what we're doing is we're not centering the truth, right? So they are a settler colonial regime. Yes, there is apartheid within their system. However, this suggests that Palestinians want to live with the abuser, that Palestinians want to live with this colonial empire. The words such as uncivilized and barbaric, they suggest that the people who cause destruction are civilized. And I've seen well-meaning people use this term. I've seen people that claim to support Palestine wear T-shirts that say uncivilized on them as to play into, this idea that this is not true. However, what's happening is, we're not servicing the people by centering the truth. And then also suggesting that in any way, this is complex. This is not complex at all. There is no complexity here. This suggests that there's space to determine that there are some errors and there are some faults and there are some flaws within the system. And it shifts the focus away from liberation. It almost makes people think, well, maybe the settler colonial regime has some kind of capacity within them to extend rights or equality or some sort of humanity when we say that this is complex. what are some ways that we could support a liberated Palestine considering our physical distance? And the reason I always say physical distance is because for a lot of us, we carry Palestine within us. And so from our position of privilege, being in physical distance, what are some ways that we can support? This can look like creating and being in community to support one another. The center is a great example of that. We can also all find spaces where we're able to create that community. Earlier, we talked about not publicly displaying hopelessness. You could certainly do this in a safe space in a circle, right? Your anger and your sadness and your frustration and the feeling of betrayal by every nation outside of Yemen in the global community. These feelings are all valid, and so when we create space for each other, we can process this. The solidarity and unity amongst communities that are forced into marginalization. And so I'm going to call us out a little bit, but sometimes we do have an expectation that communities that are marginalized are going to show up for and support the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian liberation movement. But are we supporting other people's movements? So that's also very important for us to think about, in particular with our Black community. Centering Palestinian voices, particularly those that are in occupied Palestine, highlighting the needs of the people on the ground, which ties us back to the principles that are foundational and that are our core. And also having a moral compass and having principles in our actions and in our words. This might look like, being okay with rejecting an opportunity, rejecting some kind of monetary gain. So this can either be for students or for our own children. If you're somebody who doesn't have children, this could just be for young people in a community space. Oftentimes people talk about, well, how do we talk to our kids about Palestine? Whether we're Palestinians in the diaspora or people that are non-Palestinian supporters. And I would also say centering the truth even for children. Recently, I talked to the older of my two boys about, because I felt the need to counter, to provide a counter narrative to what we've been seeing. But I talked to him about how Palestinian men are very capable of compassion. And we watched videos of Palestinian men and talked about Palestinian men who were extending their compassion to children and to animals. I'm sure a lot of you saw a lot of the experiences with people and their cats or their dogs. And so it's important that we're countering what our children, our young people are being constantly exposed to. Because otherwise, they might internalize this as a norm. Developing an awareness within our children, having Palestinian representation in the home. However, we just want to be mindful not to only stop at the representation, because then it might fall into, a surface level, unintended performative kinds of act. So this can look like books, art, journalism, activism, history, science, and looking at what it is that Palestinians have contributed to. I would do the same thing with all marginalized communities as well in our young people. We cannot rely on the public school system to teach our children and our young people about any kind of marginalized group in an authentic way. More times than not, all marginalized groups have been erased from curricula and from teachings through the public school system. And whenever they are represented, if maybe like once a year on Dr. King's holiday or such, it's typically something very stereotypical. So how can Palestinian families in the diaspora teach their children about Palestine while also honoring joy in Palestinian identity? This is very challenging because the first thing that we think about when we think of Palestinian identity is Palestinian suffering. And so we can sit with that truth because that is part of the Palestinian experience. However, we don't want to just stop there and allow our children to think, well, this is the story and the reflection of the Palestinian people, and there isn't anything to them outside of being an oppressed people. It also is appropriate to talk about people that organize and form groups to resist oppression as well. Some ways that we can teach our children joy surrounding Palestine are through storytelling. So this can be through grandparents, this can be through community members, organizing, attending events or rallies, focusing on things that are cultural, books that center Palestinian voices. There are so many books written by authors who have Western identities on every marginalized group. And sometimes, like, you're at a Barnes and Noble, you get excited and you pick up the book. Read the author's name first, because we want it to be that authentic experience where if somebody's writing a particular story, who better to tell us the story than the person who had that lived experience? So what does this look like in the home? This might look like involvement in the schools, collecting books by Palestinian authors, or, you know, for that sake, any author from any marginalized group and donating it to a school library, having it in your home library so that this is normal. We want the voices of people who are non-Western to be normalized into the homes. And also, it's very important to discuss this false illusion of acceptance. Because when we talk about acceptance, you're centering people who are supporters of imperialism and colonialism. So people that support such entities cannot be accepting of people from marginalized groups. And oftentimes this becomes something where people are chasing after a feeling, people are chasing after acceptance. And so as we're growing and shifting and changing for the better, particularly as a collective, we want to think about not centering this false idea of acceptance by a Western community. And also finding people that are either in your town, school, county, neighborhood, whatever it may be, might even be like your social media community, but people who are also like-minded. Because as people, we do need to feel that we are in solidarity with one another. I have some slides related to teachers, but is that not? That's okay. So how do we incorporate Palestine in the classroom? This can also, I'm wondering what this can also look like in the home. So it's not just teacher-centered, but even as community members, even as non-parents. So how can teachers effectively incorporate diverse literature in the classroom? How can teachers effectively incorporate authentic, multicultural, multi-ethnic literature to represent their student population? And how can teachers encourage and incorporate a student voice? How can we honor our students' lived experiences through their learning process? So we know that there are no requirements in school as per teaching related to Palestine. We know that this is considered very controversial and challenging and difficult to teach about in the school system. In reference to New Jersey, there are state mandates that relate to teachings. One of them is the Amistad. I think that was in 2012. Yes, okay. And so that relates to authentically teaching about Black history. And so there are even ways where you can find Black and Palestinian solidarity to include Palestine. And so although it could be challenging, we can find ways that we're teaching our young people about Palestine through their learning experience. We might also want to just completely not rely at all on the public education system and teach our young people outside of school. Oftentimes there's such a reliance on the school day and what kids are gaining from that experience. However, we know that this is not an authentic learning experience. Our children their identities are being completely erased if you're from any marginalized community through that process. And what is the lack of representation or inauthentic representation? And this is just from some research articles. I'll read the first one there. Children's self-image is negatively impacted and affected by the way in which they see themselves in both text, verbal, and visual. Oftentimes, our kids might not even know that they are represented or that their people have made contributions in any way. In my years of teaching, I had an experience where a student who had an Indian background, and as a 12th grader approached me and was very emotional, and I had just recently brought in, probably the week before, an excerpt from a novel written by Arundhati Roy, an excellent Indian author. And so she came to me in tears and said, I didn't even know there were authors from India. And so you might think that as an adult, this is obvious. Of course, people have made contributions from every single place globally. But if our children have never had the exposure, they might not know that there are people who have made contributions to every single content area. And so to counteract these stereotypes, our kids must have access to counter narratives. And that takes us back to the example that I discussed earlier related to Palestinian men who are able to extend their compassion. So what are some tools of deconstruction as far as children are concerned? Our children rightfully have the opportunity to see themselves reflected and represented authentically. When we do so, what happens as a result is that young people develop an understanding and an appreciation for one another. And so we start to be able to break down these prejudgments and these stereotypes that have been internalized. Discrimination as a result may decrease. Acceptance may increase as a result of having awareness about other people, starting to learn and connect with solidarity, thinking about different marginalized groups. And also, because stereotypes in literature are reinforced, this is why we must make it our duty to constantly, although it's exhausting but worth the exhaustion, constantly provide counter narratives to what our kids are being exposed to, whether it's our own children, our communities. And this is just a summary of the last couple of slides. So we are having a Q&A, which I'm excited for. Besma, are you facilitating the Q&A?
Do you want us to turn off the live so people are more comfortable? Yeah. Okay. The answer for you.
Okay, so thank you, Thuraya.